Good morning. Today is April 16th, 2022, and this is a continuation of our series of anecdotes. In logic, the scientific method. Somebody will come up to you and say, "This is the scientific method." Take an honest guess about something, turn that guess into a hypothesis, conduct a double-blind test, take the results of that test, compare it with your initial guess, adjust your guess accordingly, and do it again. I imagine the idea of try 3 things, take the best, and try 3 more is a derivative of that. Somebody will come up to you and say, "This is a scientific method." There's a patient in a hospital bed in a hospital, and there are 4 people, for our anecdotes, standing around him. One will say, "He's doing things naturally, and he calls himself a medicine man," and he promptly starts shaking a rattle and taking peyote. Another person will say, "He's a doctor and he does things the intellectual way, and he recommends you euthanize a patient and use the resources for him." There's a third person, that's usually you and I, and we say something like this: "I'd like to help this patient, but there's nothing I can do. I haven't a clue on what to do. All I can do is have empathy." And then there's the 4th doctor. And the 4th doctor is what you and I think of as a medical doctor. And I remind myself that those kinds of doctors come out of monks and monasteries. And he tells himself something like this: "I'm going to maximize benefits and maximize utilities by trying to make this patient well." And then he gets started. He starts saying a complete sentence inside his head, and he starts observing the things in front of him. Perhaps a high fever, and a fast heartbeat, and a swollen face. Then he goes into his memory and starts thinking of the symptoms he's learned. Those symptoms themselves came out of a sense of research. He decides it has to be one of 2 diseases, or perhaps a 3rd disease that he's never heard of. Then he takes actions forward. He conducts some tests to have a sense of comprehension, and then he has a plan to make the patient better. The scientific method. The Catholics proper go one better. They'll say, all these thoughts are just thoughts in your head, so the idea is to coincide those thoughts with the outside world. And the better you can explain the outside world, the better off you are. They'll start by saying things such as this: there's those things over there, we'll give them a name, we'll call them trees. And then let's give a name to the name tree, we'll call it a noun. And with a noun and the things that go with it, verb and adverb and adjective, we can describe that noun in detail and in time. And there's 8 parts of that. We'll call that the 8 parts of a speech, and we can gain a sense of comprehension. Somebody named Aristotle came along and said, well, there are nouns and common nouns and singular nouns. There are trees and fruit trees and apple trees. And so there's a sense of categories. And with a sense of categories, he can take 2 things that you know about and discover some 3rd thing that you don't, and have a sense of discovery. If you've ever heard anybody say, all B are C, all A are B, all A are C, that's what they're making reference to. You can get into that and come up with things called math and chemistry equation. And you can come up with words that describe an emotion, very difficult to describe of an emotion. And so you end up with 3 things, I'll say: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. A sense of comprehension, a sense of discovery, and a sense of understanding. They really get into it, and the Catholic proper will do things such as say a rosary, which will teach you to say a complete sentence inside your head and to associate those words with emotions. And then going to Mass once a week, and confession once a month, and Lent once a year. And that has to be the prima donna logic course in the history of human beings on this earth. We need a course inside of that, a course that will, some sort of 16 weeks week 1, day 1, hour 1 type course. And the person you're listening to is nobody to turn to come up with a course like that. That's for the young and big and strong to stand up to a bum's rush. With that said, these are some of the things the person you're listening to does. I sit in a chair and tell myself, after praying a rosary and going to Mass and going to confession and that sort of thing, I tell myself, I'm going to pretend I'm an actor, and then I'm going to try and get into the character of being normal and well-adjusted. And what things do I do? When it comes to fear, I try and go over the things times when people told me I better be afraid of them, or the times I lacked stability and security. And we also have our rude exercise. I close my eyes, I fantasize about the gals until I become romantically involved. I do it again, only this time I'm trying to get the gal pregnant. And if you're young, guy or gal, you can see a sense of original sin in a big hurry. Next, I pretend there's a priest on one side of me and a pimp on the other. And the priest tells me he exists, therefore be an American Yank. And the pimp says such things as, I only meant it if I could get away with it, and, well, sometimes he just likes to act like a scoundrel. When it comes to a pimp, I have some exercises, I use some exercises such as these. I go back to our rude exercise, only this time I separate the act of romance with the act of getting the gal pregnant, and I can see I can start to see how perverted the pimp is. Another exercise I use is to tell myself, I'm not going to do anything about this, and then tell myself, what is it that I'm not going to do anything about? And that helps me to get over that initial bum's rush. Another thing I tell myself, another exercise, is to tell myself to walk away, regroup, and restrain, and then to walk away, regroup, and restrain in order to defend a third person. And the first reminds me of the idea that they're committing an act of violence, and I'm just not getting around that. I have to find a way to deal with that. And the latter reminds me that I just can't stand up to a bum's rush. I have to have a person do it for me, and I have to stand up for another person. Another exercise I tell myself is, I'm not in charge, and you're not going to be in charge either. You want to be in charge? Be a priest or the church, and we deliberately put the church in charge. That said, we're in the pews, we're an American Yank. And then I tell myself, all glory is God's, and if all glory is God's, then it's the common housewife and that doctor we were talking about. Those two can take Wednesdays off, and they can go play in that silly tennis tournament they have once a year, and there you go. I have to put in something else that's personal. When it comes to standing up to people who hustle, that's quite an Achilles heel with me. I call that my alcoholism. And the philosophers, so I tried to make a big deal out of it. The philosophers will say, try and get into the character of that sort of person, and try and know how they feel and think, and have a sense of definition. Then pull yourself out of it, come back over here, and you can debate it. And so I tried to do just that. I tried to put myself into their shoes, and I started to get successful at it, and I realized just how perverted and queer and malicious they are, and how many people are hurt by this. I got into a sense of despair and frustration, and started getting the habit of rubbing my hand into my face, and ended up dislocating the retinas in my eyes. You don't have to go that far, but you do have to get into the character of being an American Yank. And if you're the gal, you have 4 children and 1 husband. How much of a budget do you need to get everybody out of want and into plenty? And if you're the American Yank and a guy, how many hours do you have to work? How many hours do you work in order to come up with those resources? The Catholic priest versus not the Catholic priest. The scientific method. The American Yank. That's it. That's all for now. We'll see you on the next anecdotes.